Greetings, YouTube friends. The July new moon opens the doorway to the rare outer planetary basket pattern taking shape this month. I'm joined by my friend KM to explore the deeper meaning of this lunation and the profound outer planetary alignment shaping up in July. Welcome, KM.
Thanks, Margo.
So this month is quite an astounding month, and the alignments taking shape are really profound and have layers of cyclical interpretation that we can apply. There's short-term cycles, there's medium-term cycles, and there's intergenerational cycles. So I'm looking forward to unpacking this. I'm thinking I'm going to go ahead and just screen share.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
It's extraordinary. I keep thinking about the fact that some of these cycles are so long, and this aspect pattern probably has not happened before in the way it's happening. How do we integrate that long-term way of understanding change with the intense, shorter-term pressure cooker that we all feel in the world right now? And I think that's why it's great to look at this new moon on the 13th as a doorway into it, because it's in Cancer, which is by sign in conjunct or square to the outer planet alignment. So it's the only planet besides Chiron in a water or earth sign. Everything else is air and fire. And that leads to this, I think, doorway from the past. If Cancer is nostalgic and focused on the internal world and perhaps history and memory, into a new world of air and fire that moves so quickly. Do you like that way of thinking about it?
I do. I love that way of thinking about it. And you know, what really stands out to me too is that on the actual new moon, we have the sun, the moon, and Mercury very tightly orbed with about a 3-degree orb away from the new moon, all sitting really on the ascendant over New York City, the ascendant being at 22 degrees of Cancer. And you know, the part of fortune, which we talk a lot about in financial astrology and in the videos here, is always on the ascendant during a new moon. But what's unique is that this new moon with Mercury in orb is all on the ascendant, therefore making it conjunct the part of fortune. And so you've got all of this energy. You don't have Venus in here, but you've got all of this, the personal planetary energy, or the majority of the personal planetary energy, or the acute shorter term cycles, like you said, sitting in Cancer. And then you've got all of these outer planets positioning themselves for this really astounding basket shape that is taking place. That I'll just give like a brief preview before we dive into the basket. But this is the basket shape that's shaping up in July. So let's hop back to the new moon. But I just wanted everybody to be able
Well,
to.
I think
Yeah.
it's interesting to have that image up there, though, Margot, because here's what I want people to think about. Astronomically, every planet that has a further orbit from Earth is going to be in an air fire sign: Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Because
Yeah.
Chiron is a minor planet or an asteroid, but all of the traditional planets are going to be in air and fire signs. But the moon, Mercury, and Venus are not. And those are the inner planets, or the celestial bodies closest to Earth. And notice how we go from July 13th, where we have a new moon in a water sign that is in conjunct, perhaps a little uncomfortable, to the peak of this outer planet configuration with the moon in another water sign in Scorpio,
Mm-hmm.
being the handle of the basket. And the reason people probably know why it's called a basket is that the trapezoid down below is the base, and then the handle or the peak of it is that moon in Scorpio.
Yeah, and I look forward to unpacking this because it kind of weaves together again. The theme that we're looking at is pulling in the shorter term cycles, the medium term cycles, and the long term cycles, and using the short term cycle as a release valve for this basket here with the moon here at the apex or the handle of the basket. So I think this is a really big theme that you're bringing up, that we're talking about, seeing the luminaries and the personal planets as a, I guess we could call it a release valve, really, or in a totally different position. In this case, bringing a totally different energy through the weaving of the outer planets that is forming this really long running theme. You had a quote. Wasn't it a Ernest Hemingway quote?
It's a Hemingway quote where someone asks, "How did you go bankrupt?" And he says, "Suddenly and then all at once." And it's one of my favorite cliches or quotes for events that applies everywhere: financial crises, political revolutions, change in general. And we do live in a very physical world, in a 3D reality that has these changes that take time. Things physically take time. But then we also live in a world that's increasingly technological, energy based, both traditional sources of energy and new sources. And that can be something that moves faster than we can think. In fact, air and fire are so fast because they feed each other. The Western US is consumed by forest fires right now, and they move so quickly, especially when the wind and the air is in the wrong direction or amplified. And so we want to think about where are things slower and bigger picture, and where are they moving so fast we might not even be able to keep track of it. And the reason I think this new moon bridges that gap is that earlier in the week, actually this week, tomorrow, we're recording on July 5th, the sun is going to square Saturn. That's a tension between what are we building with this global reset that was the Saturn Neptune conjunction in February. What are we resetting? What are we starting? What's the new reality of Neptune and Saturn together? And then what are we having to do, or what limits do we have going into that new reality? That's the focus before the new moon. And then the new moon is still kind of, it's in a loose about 7 degrees square with Saturn. But right after it's new, it moves into Jupiter, or it moves into Leo, conjoins Jupiter in a fire sign. So I just see the moon as transitioning us from one older reality into a newer one, that this 10-day period of extraordinary lineup of planetary aspects is indicating.
Yeah, I really like that interpretation. And, I also will call to everyone's awareness. And I've talked a little bit about this over the year because we've had a prominently placed asteroid Hygeia for some
Mm.
time now. And Hygeia is sitting at 0 degrees of Leo right now, very quickly approaching a conjunction with Jupiter, which will take place in the early degrees of Leo in early August. And so when I look at all of the events that are taking place as we make our way towards that conjunction, Hygeia is implicated whenever Jupiter is implicated right now. And so Hygeia is also within, it's a 9 degree orb of that new moon, but it is placed in the first house over New York City. And that's the first house is correlated to identity, right? And so there's something about health crises, or maybe technological, maybe health technology revolutions that is surfacing. I've done a lot of research on backtesting the Jupiter Hygeia conjunctions, and there is an incredible correlation to epidemics, and specifically even the Ebola epidemic, which we just have been seeing an escalation of Ebola in Africa recently. And the 3 out of the last 4 Ebola outbreaks have taken place during a Hygeia Jupiter conjunction. But I just think that there's a component in this lunation, because this new moon is taking place just on the ascendant, which is the identity of our country over New York City, which is, I position the charts over New York City instead of Washington, D.C., because I'm looking a lot of times at financial charts. But the ascendant is very close, whether it's at Washington, D.C. or New York City. So this is definitely activating the first house issues. Interestingly enough, another thing to note from a financial astrology perspective is that the ascendant represents the buyers. And so we do have Mercury tightly orbed, Mercury representing the markets, right? In Cancer, tightly orbed to this new moon, and the part of fortune representing the buyers. So to me, I think it's possible that we see some strong buying taking place around this new moon.
Yeah, especially coming off of that square with Saturn, which I know you have a pivot harmonic, I think on Tuesday for some of the markets, and that's also an orb of Saturn square the sun. So it's a great doorway. And actually, that's the main point that we wanted to talk about the moon. I thought before we talk about the basket, I want to quickly show the maps of the new
Yeah.
moon because it emphasizes the nature of the doorway. So is this now visible for you?
Yep. Yep.
So you can see this includes declination, but you can see the sun and moon line are these brown lines straight through the eastern seaboard. And in fact, the moon with declination included is actually quite close to DC. Is that
Hmm,
interesting?
that is
But then
interesting.
the sun is incredibly close to New York.
Hmm.
So when we think about this moon as the doorway, we could also even look at the maps of this as where are the outer planet aspects going to be emphasized? We have the power of politics and finance in the northeast of the US. We have Venezuela and Brazil and South America emphasized. And then, wow, we have Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and the Middle East emphasized once again. And I can't emphasize how extraordinary this is because this doesn't happen every new moon. It doesn't happen every aspect. And yet, time and time again, you and I have noticed the correlations between where these maps occur. And this is a midheaven line or a culminating line. And it is going to emphasize the importance of this region for the upcoming basket.
That,
Did
yeah,
you?
that's amazing. Is there any implication with Russia? I'm just curious, in Ukraine by any chance?
The moon, that's a great question. Yeah, it goes right up into Moscow, pretty
Hmm.
close, and through eastern Ukraine. And look at this. Where has been a lot of the fighting been happening right now in the Ukraine war? It's been in Crimea, right?
Wow.
And so the new moon is right there. That's a good catch. And then the third place where it's going is off the coast of Japan, which we know with the yen carry trade and all of the changes in yen's economy, that's on the descendant, which is about partnership and relations with other countries. And it's
Mm.
right there, going into not only parts of Indonesia, but then Western Australia. In fact, if anyone's based in Australia, I have seen so many activations of Perth in Western Australia in the maps in recent weeks. I'd love to know some more details of what's going on because that news isn't making it my way. But the four big lines are going to be Western Australia, Japan, this MC line, which is through Middle East, Moscow, and Ukraine, and then the AC line, which is over the Northeast and South America. Incredible, huh?
Yeah, that is incredible. It's really implicating all of the primary geopolitical hotbeds essentially
Hmm.
in the world right now. Um,
Yeah,
Fascinating.
and another part of this new moon is it's happening right after the moon is going to be in Gemini. So when the moon is in its waning crescent form, getting ready to lose all of its light, which is a monthly period of letting go and releasing, it's going to cross over, it's going to conjoin Mars and Uranus, which just conjoined themselves on July 4th. And so it's interesting to me that on the new moon, Uranus is activating the West Coast, especially California, pretty close to Silicon Valley. So I'm expecting some of the changes and really unexpected triggers of Mars Uranus to continue this week because the new moon is right after the moon passes over that conjunction.
Oh, that's fascinating. So yes, we should look and see. Do you have the date for when that activation takes place, when the moon passes over that 3-degree Gemini
Yeah, we
spot?
could look at that real quick. Yeah, it's different for Mars and Uranus because they'll be slightly different, but
Yeah.
we can look at it real quick. I think the Mars portion of it is more interesting probably right now, but that would be exactly on June 11th. And this is going to be in, again, it doesn't matter where the location is when you're looking at maps because it's all over. The part of fortune is the only one that's impacted, but this would be the exact time.
Wow, look at Chiron running straight through the middle of the United States. That's kind of
Yeah.
interesting. Huh.
Emphasizing the divisive nature. I mean, Uranus has been a time of divisions in the US before, not only with the Civil War, but the Revolutionary War was actually quite a divisive time where there was still a number of people in the colonies who were supportive of English rule and the English crown. And during World War II, there were a lot of people who were isolationists and didn't want to enter World War II. So we know that Uranus and Gemini, the sign of the twins, can be a divisive period. And to see Chiron straight through there, it is interesting. It impacts the US a lot on a lot of these charts.
Yeah, it really does. That is fascinating to track that. So July 11th, as potentially an activation point, I mean, perhaps tech is implicated in that. What are your thoughts on that? Like the NASDAQ has been,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. I think that there's something that's going to be involved with technology, and it could be a surprise release. It could be a change, maybe Fable 5 becomes available to everyone free. I don't know what exactly it is,
yeah.
but I do have to say, when you look at the patterns of not only all the work that you do in your Discord, but the new moon being right over the ascendant, the buyers in New York, it does suggest that this opens a doorway to perhaps a frenzied tech consumption into the basket and
Hmm.
this extraordinary lineup. I think that's what we should transition to talk about is the basket and all of the important geometry implications of it. So I'll let you share now.
Yeah, definitely. Let's let me just I'm going to start with an overview of how I'm viewing the basket. And I obviously have a knack for pattern recognition and geometry and mathematics. And so when I first saw this, the thing that jumped out at me was the trapezoid or the parallelogram that is forming the basket section. And that it's made a parallelogram by nature is made up of two parallel lines, and those two parallel lines never intersect. That's the nature of parallel lines. So we have two running themes, the Jupiter Pluto theme and the Uranus Neptune theme, that are running it and not necessarily converging, but being woven together by the trines that are taking place. And so those cycles are the Jupiter Neptune cycle or trine and the Uranus Pluto trine. And we have inside of all this different different duration cycles. So a synodic cycle is the cycle between two planets. And so these are all different synodic cycles that are coming to exact aspect in a very short period of time, which is part of what makes this so unique. In addition to the fact of the just general shape that they're forming, right? But I think I want to, if you don't mind, if I talk for just a second, I think I'm just going to unpack these two themes real quick of the parallel lines, because that it really kind of blew my mind when I dug into these. So we've got first the long running theme is the Uranus Neptune theme, and the Uranus Neptune cycles 171 years. That's the duration of time it takes for those planets to form a conjunction and then go through all of the other aspects that they'll go through before they form a conjunction again. And what we are inside of in this cycle is the waxing sextile. And this cycle was seeded in 1993, actually, which is very fascinating. There's some really important, fascinating things when we look at sextiles, trines, squares, or oppositions. We want to look at the seed cycle, which was the conjunction, because the events that took place and the degree of the conjunction are themes that will weave through every aspect through the rest of the cycle. And so if we take a look at the 1993 conjunction of, hold on, let me get there. There we go. There's the 1993 conjunction of Uranus and Neptune. This took place at 18 degrees Capricorn. Capricorn is really about institutions and hierarchy and control from a more collective standpoint, right? It's also about hard work. It's also about setting goals. Capricorn's ruled by Saturn, right? And so what stood out to me when I started looking at these seed cycles is that the two parallel lines, the Uranus-Neptune cycle and the Jupiter-Pluto cycle, both of those seed cycles actually happened in mid to late Capricorn, really bringing in the theme of institution into these planetary themes. And basically the Uranus-Neptune theme is it's the cycle of technological vision. It's collective imagination. It can be spiritual innovation and also future-oriented breakthroughs. But really, the one thing that stood out to me is that what happened in 1993. Well, there's two major things that stood out to me that happened in 1993. First is that the European Union formally came into being via a treaty on November 1st of 1993. This was just 8 days after the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. So this brings matters of the European Union front and center as we move into this sextile, and that's one theme that I see running. But the other one, and the one that's much bigger and more widespread, is that the World Wide Web, actually, this was fascinating when I learned this. CERN actually helped open the global communication system. A gentleman named Tim Berners-Lee developed the World Wide Web at CERN in 1989 as a way for scientists across institutions to share information easily. And in April of 1993, CERN placed the web's core software into the public domain. This allowed anyone to build websites, browsers, and servers without licensing restrictions. This changed the world as we know it. And this is one of the primary long-running themes. I'm going to pause for a second because I could talk about this for a really long time.
No, I love everything you're saying, and I think you're so genius to look at this from a parallel. Because what are we talking about here? We're talking about 1993 and the birth of the consumer internet. And we're talking about 2020 because that was the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And both of them speak about tech, power, and individuality versus institution. And
Yes.
even though they're parallel, here's a really nerdy math thing. They're not exactly because it is 4 degrees and a couple minutes off, right? So at some point, they're going to collide in the far future, but they're also, like you said, being woven together. And so when I think about this, I think Jupiter in Leo is self-expressive, bold, individualistic, bumping up against not only Pluto and Aquarius technology and AI, but also the new techno-feudalism, the world we live in with the technological institutions. And then you have Neptune in Aries creating a new vision of individuality, of independence. And it is bumping up against, or at least connecting with, all of the changes happening with how we communicate and transport ourselves around the world with Uranus and Gemini. But all of them together are being woven together to say, how is technology coming together in this moment, both 1993 and 2020, two seminal years? I remember installing a modem in 1993 in my family's computer and having no idea what I was doing, but just figured it out. And it was such a big moment of the individual accessing the internet. And so now we are reflecting on that with the first sextile. And we are also reflecting on 2020. 2020 was a huge change for technology. That's when work remote, that's when Zoom, that's when everything became online. We entered the age of air, a much more diffuse time. Even if the, Jupiter Pluto conjunction was before the great modality shift, it was in the same year where we're shifting to an online world. And so I think a big part of this parallelogram trapezoid is how are we reckoning with power and individuality in this new era? And that's why we may not see the answers to that for many. I think we're not going to even begin to see the end of this until Pluto leaves Aquarius in the 2040s. But
Yeah,
we,
I love that. I love that you just wove in personal and sovereignty and individuality into this because that really adds another layer of dynamic to the whole story. That's
you,
great.
you know, you know why I keep thinking that? Because I work a lot in entertainment, in filmmaking, and there's such an existential crisis right now about what does it mean to be self-expressive as a Leo? What does it mean to create when we have these internet or these AI tools that can do it for you? Is there even a future of human actors, human writers, human filmmakers?
Mm.
And that's for me in my smaller world, the Jupiter Pluto opposition. Of course, that's just one way of looking at it, but the individual versus the collective. I mean, I don't think people are aware of how much the technology changes have led to very little personal autonomy. If you want to use the banking system, the healthcare system, anything really, you have to engage with the technology system and one of the big hyperscalers. And that I think is something we're going to confront this month and into the coming years.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that that is a really big component of that cycle. And, another thing that was seeded in 2020 pertaining to, because in 2020, here, real quick, I'll just share that conjunction so that everybody can see what we're talking about. So the Jupiter Pluto conjunction in 2020 took place at 22 degrees Capricorn. So keeping in mind that's only 4 degrees off of where that Uranus Neptune conjunction was, right? The other thing that there was actually three conjunctions that took place
There were, yeah.
between Jupiter and Pluto in 2020. The last one was in November. The first one was earlier on in April. But looking at the final one, this one took place as we were barreling full force into confronting the reality of the supply chain limitations and the damage that was
So true.
done pertaining to all of the power and control that was given to the institutions and exerted over the individual, right? So sorry, my son just walked in the room. So it was really, we started to see supply chain issues take place there. And so I'm curious on, looking at this as a medium term cycle, right? Because the Jupiter Pluto cycle is only about 12.46 years. What are we going to see emerge during this opposition, right? That might pertain to the supply chain issues that we haven't really seen surface yet that arise or have arisen out of the conflict over in the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz, right? Will we potentially see, as we barrel through this, maybe an unraveling of that and how that's actually impacting kind of the deeper underneath the surface, talking about Pluto, things we're not seeing in the economy and such right now.
I think that's such a great point because, our friend Juan, who is doing great cycles work and other work, he said in his last public YouTube that if we're not seeing oil and energy prices going up into July, then the market is not pricing in the supply chain issues and the depleted reserves worldwide. And so perhaps now, we're in July now and oil keeps going down. Perhaps there's a reflection on the fact that the reserves worldwide are so depleted and unable to withstand another shock like we've been experiencing the past few months. I think that's really great. And for me, I keep thinking about Jupiter Pluto as a confrontation of power. Pluto is all about power.
Yeah.
And when people talk about financial crises and credit crises with Jupiter Pluto oppositions, it's because money is the primary form of power in our capitalist system. And so we want to think about if Jupiter Pluto conjunctions in 2020 led to that huge wealth, I don't know what you want to even call it, not
Transfer.
redistribution, but just distribution with,
Yeah.
in the US, the stimulus checks, the PPP money that changes the huge equity market run up after the COVID, correction or whatever you want to call it. And now we're 6 and some odd years later looking at that and saying, how did that change our economy? We're still facing the inflationary impacts of that. How did that change our power structures? How did that even change trading? Because that was really what gave birth to the retail investor, the Aquarian age of the retail investor, when everyone had all this extra money on hand to trade crypto and use Robinhood. And I think we're going to reflect on that in July and into the rest of the year.
That makes a lot of sense. Jupiter in Leo, I did a study that I shared in my Discord, that Jupiter, the theme, Jupiter spends 1 year roughly in a sign. And so we can tend to look to the theme of the sign that Jupiter's in to find sectors that perhaps maybe will exhibit greater strength and whatnot. But what was interesting about Jupiter transiting through the sign of Leo is that it's really dependent on the regime. There is no sector that stands out overall when backtesting as better than others, because it really depends on where we're at. And Jupiter transiting the sign of Leo oftentimes can correlate to, approaching recessionary environments or major changes, major shifts, and not always. So the behavior of the financial markets correlated to Jupiter in Leo is definitely regime dependent. And so it's interesting that we're headed into this big outer planetary alignment as Jupiter is transiting through the sign of Leo. And also on the same day as this Jupiter Pluto opposition, we're also going to have a Jupiter Neptune trine, right? And
Yeah,
that,
and honestly, that scares me. I know it shouldn't necessarily, but with Jupiter and Neptune, you really can struggle to see clearly. And I have a vivid memory of Jupiter Neptune conjunction in April 2022, perhaps because it was in my first house. But I remember thinking, this is going to be great. Wow, abundance and Lisa Frank dolphins coming out of the ocean. And instead, it was this overwhelming, almost intoxicating energy that made it really hard to do anything. And again, maybe that's my personal experience. It was hitting my chart quite closely. But I do think that this is a fog and perhaps a deceptive fog because it could feel really exciting and bold and creative with being in fire signs. It might give a lot of people or all of us the sense that we can just march boldly and do no wrong. I think that there could be some really big trading mistakes around this because people are going to feel that confidence of Aries and the confidence of Leo flowing unrestricted between each other. And it just is gives me pause that that's happening the same day as a very tense Jupiter Pluto opposition, because I don't know if we'll be able to see that. And like you said, it's the only opposition in this cycle, unlike the three conjunctions we had in 2020.
yeah. Well, the other thing too, that to your point about the Jupiter Neptune, let's call it hysteria or exuberance potentially in financial markets, right? Um, is that when I back tested Jupiter Neptune trines, what it's actually most closely related to is speculative peaks in the markets, and not to the day. It's more like to the quarter, like
Interesting.
a 3 or 4 month time band. You oftentimes see kind of buying hysterias actually around this time period. So it seems potentially really good, but ultimately it's like a big expression that is going to need to resolve itself in some we could call it consolidation. Sometimes it's further downside than just consolidation, but that's definitely notable to me as far as financial market stuff. The other thing is I'm just going to go back to highlighting Hygeia here, right? We've got Hygeia at 2 degrees of Leo, so tightly orbed to Jupiter as it's making its trine to Neptune. Will we potentially see maybe? I mean, I'm just curious. I don't like to forecast negativity, but I know that like historically through back testing, that there's something, and I just should have prepped my results actually, but it's around 80 to 88% probability chance of there being a correlation to an epidemic of some sort. Now, this was not a correlation to there was no Jupiter Hygeia aspect happening during the COVID pandemic. That was a different set of variables. But things like Zika, things like Ebola, the AIDS epidemic actually arose during a Jupiter Hygeia conjunction. So these are the sort of things that kind of have my attention. And with the sun moving in to make its conjunction with Jupiter just a few days after this, right? That's really going to shine this bright light or illuminate the matters related to Jupiter Hygeia in that both trine to Neptune and that opposition to Pluto.
Yeah, there's two things I want to respond there. One, Hygeia, for people who don't know it, can be really about general health too and sanitation. And one of the concerns I have is all of the wildfires that are happening in the US and elsewhere from the heat, from
Mm,
this fire astrology. And could there be a public health issue that's not even just a pandemic, but tied to smoke inhalation or fire damage in some way? Do you remember a few years ago when even New York City was covered in smoke from the Canadian fires
I do.
and how they weren't? And I think there was another time in New York where it was impacted by fires in the US Rockies. So that's one of the things I'm watching with all this fire and air energy. Once we begin Leo season on, I believe, the 22nd or 23rd, we're going to have very little energy. We're going to have like Mercury is the only planet in the water sign to cool things down. And
Yeah,
so
that is
what
true.
also happens, what happens really close to the sun conjoining Hygeia is the end of the basket, the final configuration. So I'm going to quickly go through them because you're a really great at the parallelogram and the geometry. I'm such a dates and numbers person. That's where my Virgo spectrumy energy comes from. And so it's like July 15th is Neptune Uranus. July
Do you want to
17th
screen
is
share,
Uranus.
or do you want me to roll
No,
through
I'm
them?
just going to read these out loud,
Okay,
and you
cool.
don't even need to know them, but just to know how they go. July 17th is Uranus Pluto. July 20th is Jupiter Neptune and Jupiter Pluto. July 21st, the moon perfects that basket and Jupiter sextiles Uranus. And then on July 24th, we have the final one of these outer planet, which is Neptune sextiling Uranus. And this is really interesting to me. I don't know if you have that
Pluto.
chart. I
Is
could
it
pull that
Neptune? It's
up.
Neptune sextiling Pluto, right?
Sorry, yeah, did I say, yeah, Neptune
Yep.
sextiling Pluto,
Yep.
because these are the two slowest moving planets. They have
Yep.
over a 400-year synodic cycle. They have not conjoined since 1892, which
Mm,
is a really interesting chart. Some astrologers call it the birth of the modern man, which is overly
mhm,
gendered, but that it's
mhm.
really the start of the new modern era that we're in. And this sextile being not only the final interaction between all the planets at 4 degrees, but being the longest running synodic cycle of all planets is really interesting to me. The sun will be in Leo by that time. We're going to have even more fire energy. And what happened in 1892 that we're going to be reflecting on? A lot of
Mm.
things. I mean, there's so many things that happened between 1892 and 1893. There's a famous World Fair that changed Chicago in the US. I mean, you could go on and on, but there was a really important panic of 1893. You know about this because we've talked about this, right?
Mhm.
And it was when the stock market bubble associated with the railroad industry began to collapse. And I
Yes.
think that's really fascinating because you and I mean, everyone in the Discord has been talking about how similar this AI infrastructure bubble is to the railroad bubble. And I'm not saying that this is going to be the crash because, the actual conjunction was 1892 and the panic didn't happen until 1893. But I liked what you were saying earlier about Neptune and Jupiter being associated with, did you call it bubbles? I forget the term you used.
Yes, as speculative peaks in the market.
Brilliant. And so is Neptune Saturn. And we had
Mm.
one singular Neptune Saturn conjunction instead of three, one singular Jupiter Neptune trine. And what did we see last winter within a couple weeks of the Saturn Neptune? Crazy speculative peaks in the metals. And
Hmm.
now, as we're coming to this Jupiter Neptune trine, we're seeing crazy speculative peaks in all sorts of tech instruments. And I just think I like that you said it's within a quarter, but I bet we see some peak of this speculation, at least a temporary peak, very close to that trine.
Yeah, this is a really profound chart right here. When you look at this, look at that, the how it's got Jupiter, Hygeia, and the sun all there in trine, within just 2 degrees of
Hmm.
exact to Neptune there. Neptune is really, and it's also it's the apex here. If you kind of look at this minor trine here between Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, right?
Yep.
So that is really um, that's yeah, and look at this. Uh Venus is headed, and I'm just like in real time looking at this right now. Venus is gonna head towards an opposition to Neptune,
Hmm.
right? Isn't
Yeah.
that, or
And
no, it
it
just
will
passed
also,
over. Actually, Venus, oh yeah, it is. No, it's in Virgo right there. So within a couple weeks, that's gonna make an opposition there to Neptune, and that's gonna form a grand kite.
yeah, in a couple days after Neptune sextiles Pluto, Venus is going to square Mars. And to me, that's one of the shorter term trigger events we want to be aware of because we're talking about such big astrology here. We want to understand what's going to be an event that has a more concrete or short term impact that we can be aware of. And I think Jupiter opposite Pluto is one of those, but even shorter term is going to be that Venus square Mars, which is on July 28th. And That's a really interesting date because that's also when Mars has its biennial return to the US Sibley chart. So what are we coming up against with Mars and Gemini having all this change in tech, transportation, communication, making us all feel very scatterbrained and busy and frenetic? How is that bumping up against Venus in Virgo, which is going to be so focused on the details and perfectionism, and it's going to be attention. That's
Yeah.
always an important square to note once a year, but I think coming right after the end of this basket, it's more important than ever.
Yeah, I think this is just an astounding number of aspects. And we
I
have,
know it's
oh yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead. It's just so hard to
I,
even comprehend.
it is. It's this is one of those challenging events to forecast too, because we haven't seen anything like this in this century, in
Yeah.
our lifetimes anyway. Or in the recent past that we can look back and say, oh, this happened when this happened. And we really just have to really look at this from a meta standpoint and really weaving together all of the things, hence the basket, right?
Hmm.
um, but the other thing that I was going to talk about that we haven't talked about yet is that there's also a grand cross happening, and it's involves Chiron. It's slightly the grand cross has got a wide orb, so because you've got Jupiter Pluto as the opposition as one side of it, and then you'll have the moon opposite Chiron, and you don't see a line here just on this particular drawing, but just the moon moves pretty quickly. So within less than 24 hours of it reaching this peak basket formation at 4 degrees Scorpio, it's going to hit 0 degrees Scorpio, which is going to be the exact opposition to Chiron at 0 degrees Taurus. And that opposition is poignant to me. And it is the release valve of the whole basket structure. And to have Chiron operating on an opposition with the moon as the release valve to the basket really tells me there, like, I really think, kind of like you said, how do you go broke slowly and then all at once, right? I think this is going to feel like one of those all at once moments because you've got the
Yeah.
moon involved, and the moon is really, it's personally about how you feel, but it's also public sentiment, right? How the collective feels and responds to things. And with it in Scorpio, you have to wonder what's going to be revealed that's underneath the surface that we're not seeing. And peak basket handle is really tightly orbed to the midheaven over New York City, right? So it's not only is it the moon as public sentiment, but the midheaven also is peak reputation. And so you've got public sentiment and reputation as the release valve here for a 0 degrees Chiron and 0 degrees Chiron in Taurus, which is really about resources. Taurus is really about it can be hard assets, right? We are also potentially moving into an 18-month cycle low on gold, right? So I think of hard assets when I think of Taurus. I think of agricultural commodities,
Things that
gold.
hold value.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Land,
And
even, you know?
And what's interesting? The one thing I do like about Chiron being at the bottom of that basket is if we're having this big conversation about individual freedom versus institutional power, technology versus human creativity, how about thinking about our values? And I could
Mm,
see Chiron and Taurus stepping in and saying, yeah, this is really cool what you guys are creating and all the technology and all the air and fire, but how about we ground it, pull it
mm,
down to the root chakra and say, what are our values?
mm.
What do we really want to create in this new era? And that could be a way to positively work with Chiron. I am often accused of being Pollyanna, but I think that I want to find ways of working with this astrology because it's so overwhelming and all of us can feel it. I think gaslighting ourselves and saying, oh, it's not that big of a deal, what's happening right now is not helpful. All of
Yeah,
us can feel it. And the tricky part is understanding when or if the pressure is going to be released. And I think this is definitely a moment where it will be. That moon in Scorpio is going to be really effective at triggering the whole basket. But there could be so many different releases. We also want to be prepared for that paradox of gradual and suddenness.
yeah,
And there being also in an age of air, in an age of Uranus and Gemini, things are going to be lurching forward and back. And even with, warfare, which is such an easy thing to observe in the collective and in the news, We're not in the age of Earth with slow, endless trench warfare. This is going to be sporadic, things that
Mhm.
pop up out of the blue, then go away and come back. I mean, the US has been at war with Iran since late February, but you wouldn't really know it. And there's a peace deal, but is it a peace deal? And so, what I'm trying to say is we have to do a really hard thing of holding two things that are paradoxical true at the same time. That we're in the middle of a multi-hundred-year reset with Neptune, Pluto alone, and there's going to be some really poignant moments. Um, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Think about next winter when not only does the human cross of the sleeping phoenix begin, which is a whole other conversation, but Mars is going to retrograde through Leo, triggering
Mhm.
this whole lineup, especially the Jupiter Pluto opposition
Well, and our eclipses coming up here
and
in
the
August
eclipses.
are
Yeah.
also going to be in Leo. And those will warrant their own whole episode. And you know what? This is very tangential, but because I always forget to do this, if you've made it this far in the video and you are really enjoying this, please don't forget to like and subscribe the video
I love
because
it.
it
Good
helps
job.
me keep doing what I'm doing. Okay, back to us.
Well,
Um, yeah.
go ahead.
No, well, what I was going to point out real quick, and you actually inspired me to really look at this when you were talking about focusing on Saturn and where Saturn is in your house and area in on your own natal chart and where it's getting activated, and that's kind of a different conversation, but it drew me into where the part of fortune is in this basket right here at peak
Mm,
basket formation on the 21st, and it's at 11 degrees Aries. It's very tightly orbed to Saturn. And so you've got two themes there. What you're talking about is our individuality and autonomy and sovereignty,
yeah.
as well as structure and form and institution. And, it could be on a personal level, it could be just manifesting your dreams into reality with that theme of the Saturn Neptune. Are my dreams real? Am I manifesting my dreams into reality? Or it could be that more collective scale of what is real value, right? But there's definitely something here about the fortune arising out of this connection here to Aries in the basket.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder because when I look at this, I see three parts. I see a new moon as a doorway into this extraordinary lineup that is really too hard for any of us as individuals to process. I want people to look for seeds of change. Are there seeds of clean energy? Are there seeds of AI becoming more humanistic or more creative? Look out for those seeds. But the way you can work with this as an individual is that Saturn energy. It's the only outer planet not at 4 degrees. And if you
Mm,
put in the work, Saturn is the concept of an equal and opposite reaction. If you put in hard work, it's going
mm,
to repay you with good rewards. If you
mhm.
run around with scissors and don't pay attention, sure, you could get hurt. But if you put in the work, and Saturn, at least in my opinion, is in a great place right now because it isn't necessarily as limiting or difficult or restrictive in Aries. And sure, maybe the containers and walls we're used to are also missing a little bit, but I think Saturn in Aries is a nice balance, at least a nice change from Saturn in Pisces, where we can work with it. We can put in the hard work. And that's where this global reset is landing in your life anyway, is the house that contains Aries or the houses that contain Aries. Where are you inspired by Neptune and putting in the work to create a new reality in some area of life? And all my friends, all my clients I talk to always agree that the Aries part of their chart is where they're focused right now. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed by the fact that we're talking about 1892 financial crises, you can pull it in on. So thanks for reminding me on that. And then I see the third part of this is entering eclipse season. So I think we're going to have a doorway. We're going to see seeds of magnificent change. And then we're going to have an eclipse season. And that could be really where things become poignant. That's where things could feel like, wow, okay, we have a final Pisces eclipse. Delulu is no longer the Solulu. We need to figure out what the reaction is to this historic set of planetary interactions.
Yeah, and there's one other really big event taking place in the end of July, which is not technically part of the basket formation, but that's irrelevant. It's still a super important thing that's happening is that the nodes are transitioning signs,
Right.
and I think we can probably make its own video about that. But it is a really powerful shift that takes place because the nodes are they're kind of the axis of fate, if you will, right? Um, you can look at them through different lenses. You can look at them through the lens of Vedic astrology, where they're both malefic, or you can look at them through the lens of evolutionary astrology, where one represents where you're headed in this lifetime and beyond, and one represents where you've been in past lifetimes. I like to combine the two meanings, but they do create an overarching theme that I see play out not only in individual lives, but also in the financial markets and the economy. And Louise McWhirter popularized or discovered, if you will, the correlation between where the nodes are and the business cycle. And the business cycle doesn't always align with the stock market cycle. But she identified a correlation to lows in the business cycle correlated to the North Node transiting Aquarius and the South Node Leo. And that's what we're headed into. And it's worth noting that, you know, public sentiment is at an all-time low, even though the stock market's at all-time highs. So those are things that also are big shifts. You know, this is a season. July is really, when I wrote my 2026 forecast book, which if anybody hasn't checked it out, it's still available for sale on Patreon. I'll put a link in the video description below. A lot of the things I was writing about are happening right now in 2026.
Yeah, it's incredible what you did there, Margo. And I think it's great. The next time you and I are going to get together will be the new moon, which is a solar eclipse in Leo, and the nodes will have changed signs, but that will be the first solar eclipse in Leo, or the first eclipse in Leo for many years. So that'll be a great transition for our next new moon video. We'll be through the basket into the unknown.
I love it. Through the basket into the unknown we go. Hi ho, hi ho. Awesome. Well, I mean, we could probably talk about this for, you know, an eternity, but I feel like we've touched on a lot of the really important pieces of what's going on. We could wind up and just mention, you know, this basket formation is being called the Barbault Basket, named after a relatively famous astrologer named Andre Barbault. And he forecasted some really big events with a high degree of accuracy over a long period of time. He studied a lot of outer planetary alignments. I actually have his book, Planetary Cycles. It's a worthy read. And he duped this, or he called it, from his perspective, the most benefic configuration of the century. And I thought that was interesting. And so, you know, it's come to be named the Barbault Basket, even though he didn't ever call it a basket.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because if you read his work, he was not an overly flowery writer and not overly optimistic. So for him to say that, which is the sentence that everyone's using now, or the provision, the paragraph everyone's repeating, is really interesting given the fact that we're in the middle of some really difficult astrology. You know, Neptune sextiling Uranus may be great for those planets, but that could be a really swift innovation of killing machines in a war context with Aries and Uranus. So, you know, there's difficult aspects of this that we don't want to be blind to, Jupiter opposing Pluto being the peak, in my opinion. But I like the fact that he reminded us there could be the seeds of really benefic change. And I think if you feel overwhelmed in the next lunar cycle until we meet next, try to focus on that. Try to say, okay, we're approaching the edge when it comes to our natural resources, but are there some seeds of change in the new energy or the clean energy industries? And that's one of the things I'm looking out for. If we're looking at changes in or difficult geopolitical relationships, are there changes in generational leadership that give us hope for the horizon? So,
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I wrote my July 2026 newsletter, I publish a monthly newsletter for everyone in my Patreon and Discord, and I cover all of the key events, and I look at the themes of each month from a financial astrology standpoint. And the theme that I channeled was the Phoenix and the crisis that brings resolution to a higher frequency. And, I remember when I typed this out to you and you said, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I was thinking. And interestingly, I've seen some other astrologers talking about this, after I published my newsletter. And so I think it's really not, I think this is a real collective theme that's arising. And I don't think it's a matter of anyone like hearing it from anyone else. It actually feels like this is in the collective fabric, and it's arising for a lot of us
Yeah.
is this awareness that whatever crisis is occurring on whatever level, and it can be all the way down to a small personal crisis or to a massive collective crisis, that there is some sort of resolution that is going to offer us a higher frequency or vibration ultimately as we get through it.
That's a great note to end on. I love that, Margo.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for coming. Do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Yes, I have a Substack and Patreon called The Weekly Stars. Please come join me. Having a lot of fun over there.
Awesome. And you can find me in my Discord or my Patreon. You can also follow me on X, and all of the links will be in the video description below. Until next time, friends.
Take care.